Thank you all for coming. It's a beautiful day today, and it's a pleasure to have Ajmal visit us. Ajmal Khan, he's as he says, a postdoctoral fellow at the South Asia Institute at Harvard University. He received his PhD from the Tata Institute for Social Sciences in Bombay, where he studied anti-nuclear power movements in India. And his current research analyzes democratic and justice challenges in the context of state-led development, environmental change, anthropogenic climate change in South Asia.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And before joining Harvard, he was a Charles Wallace Trust Fellow at SOAS in London. And I'll say a few words just to sort of contextualize why Ajmal's work is important. The climate crisis has led to a range of responses around the world. The dominant response to it has been to stress technical solutions to the problem, trying to figure out some technology that's going to somehow magically get rid of fossil fuels without sort of considering the larger social, economic, and political underpinnings that sort of led us to the climate crisis in the first place. And of these technical solutions, nuclear power plays an important role. It's been all over the news. Everybody and their brother sort of says, we have this magical solution to climate change. And there are three reasons why that's not a desirable or a feasible solution. Much of it is sort of known to you, but I'll just sort of say those things anyway, just to kind of contextualize Ajmal's work. The first is that of feasibility. As you all know, nuclear power is a very expensive way of generating electricity, high cost of construction, and it also does not fit well with the kind of timelines we have seen that the IPCC and other bodies say we require to reduce our emissions in. Because it takes a really long time to build nuclear plants. A typical plant takes about a decade. So Bob sort of started this by saying, we don't have nuclear power in BC. But imagine that, the government were to decide tomorrow that BC was going to invest in a nuclear power plant. Right. The first unit of electricity from that hypothetical power plant will probably flow 15 to 20 years from today, right? And that's kind of a timeline that's just too slow. And I'll come back to this point later also to say another thing. Anyway, so the combination of this high cost and the long timelines means that nuclear power's share of global electricity generation has been declining continuously since the mid-1990s. And that's not the way it's going to be able to contribute to climate change, because what you would like to do, if it is going to be a solution, is for it to be expanding, right? And that's not happening. The second set of feasibility questions actually has to do with the political economy of nuclear power, if you like. The way that, if you look at who is pushing for nuclear power, who's advocating for nuclear power, they tend to be individuals and groups and organizations that really benefit from the status quo. And so, the Bill Gates of the world, if you like. And they see this as just another way to keep business as usual going on, just replacing fossil fuels with nuclear power. And they also sort of, as Arundhati Roy sort of famously put it, those who caused the crisis, climate crisis, will also see to it that they profit from any solutions that are going to be done for them. And so nuclear power is part of that, and that also inversely means that should there be an expansion of nuclear power, that will try to keep in place the same structures, political and economic structures, that caused the crisis in the first place. So that's another reason why it's not going to be feasible to solve this problem through that. And the third problem is that nuclear power is inextricably linked with a range of environmental injustices, right? And these have to do with the fact that when you do set up a nuclear plant, there would have to be some sacrificial zones, essentially, that are going to be set up. Places from which uranium will have to be mined, which has a range of environmental and public health impacts on flora and fauna, to the fact that every nuclear power plant will automatically produce radioactive waste for which there is no really demonstrated solution. And that again means that should there be a site where this is going to be buried, that particular community that's going to be living there is going to be exposing them and their succeeding, future generations to potential harm. And when you site any nuclear power plant, the community is never told this, but actually what they're signing up for is that it is possible that one really bad day, one of these reactors has a meltdown, things go bad, and then people have to evacuate that and maybe never come back to their houses. This is what happened in Chernobyl, this is what happened in Fukushima. No nuclear reactor is immune from that. All reactors have a chance of having accidents. And so these are sort of injustices that are going to be borne out, and therefore, if you have to think about solving climate change in a just way, nuclear power can't be part of that. So these are, I think, some of the reasons why Ajmal's work sort of has to do with climate justice in a broad sense. It's also important because it deals with India. And India is an important country because if you were to think about nuclear power as a solution to climate change, you have to ask yourself where these reactors are going to be built, right? And if you look around the world, it's not in Canada or the United States or Western Europe that actually energy demand is growing. It's in the developing world, so to say. And those are the countries where they are building large numbers of coal plants and solar panels and all kinds of things. And that's where the nuclear plants have to be built. Now, how feasible is it that a country that either has very limited or no nuclear power today will be able to build large numbers of these over the next few decades? And India provides a good case study, as it were, to see how this might happen. So India as a country decided to invest in atomic energy way back in 1948, like a few months after the country achieved independence. And succeeding governments have offered enormous financial, political resources in support of this project. And yet today, and for the last 20 odd years that I've been sort of studying the subject, nuclear power barely constitutes about 3% of the country's electricity. It sort of goes up and down a little bit. It's sort of like what used to be called the Hindu rate of growth. It sort of stays at 3%, right? And so if a country like India, which has been trying this for 75 years, has not managed to really diversify its energy away from fossil fuels into nuclear power, what is the chance that, let's say, Nigeria or Indonesia or any of these other countries which have zero nuclear power today is going to actually build one of these things? So I think that's also a thing. And one of the important reasons why India has a relatively low level of nuclear power is the reason that Ajmal sort of did his PhD on, which is resistance from people to setting up these things. It's a very depressing field because these resistances are typically the state's response is to send the police there and beat the crap out of these people, right? And basically make sure that they cannot really exercise any kind of democratic will. But the fact that it's now 15 years since the so-called US-India nuclear deal, and there was supposed to be a huge number of reactors imported into India from the United States, from France, and so on. Not a single reactor construction started, right? And a large part of the credit has to be given to these people's movement. So that's what he's going to be talking about. And I invite you to sort of welcome Ajmal again. I will also say, Ajmal is a young, a scholar who is on the job market. I should sort of just plug that out. Any of you, if you know somebody who's looking for a young scholar, please.
But nothing in the nuclear industry.
That's for sure.
Thank you so much, Ramana, and thank you so much, Bob.
Ajmal, I'm going to try to turn the lights down.
Sure.
So that we can see your
Yeah.
image. Well,
Yeah.
that's not bad.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's good.
Once again, thank you so much for David Lamb Center here, and also for the other centers and institutions who helped me to bring here to SFU. As we speak here, last month, India's Union Minister, who is in charge of the nuclear power, so last month, India's Union Minister, who is in charge of nuclear power, goes on by saying this, that nearly 9% share of the electricity is likely to be contributed from India's nuclear sources by the year 2047, when India celebrates 100 years of its independence, and that this would help getting closer with the commitment of achieving net zero like targets by 2070, which was much like celebrated actually when India's Prime Minister had declared this, that like by 2070 India is going to be net zero. Now, like as Ramana was talking about this, that this has huge implication for the so-called like transitions that are coming from the UNFCCC processes in the context of climate change and climate action. So you could see when we look at nuclear energy historically in India, a series of statements like this, which kind of like project by saying that in the future India is going to be producing a larger share of nuclear energy from the nuclear sector in that sense. So since like Nehru, you would see like Nehru invoking the same statement. You would then see Homi Bhabha, who is considered to be like one of the father of the nuclear power program in that sense. And you would see like Manmohan Singh saying that. You would also see like Narendra Modi saying that in that sense, that how in the sometime in the future India is going to be a big nuclear power producing country in that sense, which Ramana's book have detailedly looked at and kind of answered that how and why India has not been able to produce like more than 2.5 or 3% in that sense from the nuclear. Now, India is looked at as one of the important player or an ally in that sense in terms of climate change. Now, this is from the India's INDC, which was submitted to the Paris Agreement actually, like in which India says that India is promoting nuclear power as a safe, environmentally benign, and economically viable source to meet the increasing electricity needs of the country. Now, of course, it talks about the current capacity then, and then what could possibly be India would produce in that sense from nuclear. And then again, the Department of Atomic Energy kind of goes on saying, apart from of course NPCL and most of the other bodies as well as individuals who are associated with the nuclear power in the country, would make similar statements that how and why nuclear power is going to be so important for India in the future, particularly also because of climate change. So this is again Department of Atomic Energy's statement in that sense, which kind of says that how and why, specifically in the context of nuclear power, in the climate change and transition from fossil fuels, why nuclear power is important for India. Of course, what India has now, despite these very long nuclear power program, nearly 22 reactors that produce around 65,000 megawatt electricity, which is less than 3% of the total energy which is generated in the country. This is of course, as like Ramana was saying, that it fluctuate, of course, not go beyond, like, let's say 3% in total. Now, in that context, what emerged in most of these locations where not only uranium is being mined, but also nuclear power projects were planned, proposed, and being like expanded now, where people's protest movements against these power projects as well as uranium mining all across the country. Now, this of course include, like of course we do have, or we had a very strong movement or a civil society movement in that sense, which opposed nuclear bomb in India. Now, and then the massive movement was this, that, you know, movements against nuclear power projects in that sense. And we also have movements that are opposing the uranium mining in that sense, which is one of the integral part of nuclear power program for countries like India, like particularly after India had tested the nuclear bomb in that sense, and then how did India was isolated from the global supply of uranium. So, like oppositions spread across the country from south to north to east to west. This is a sense of the nuclear establishment that India has actually now. This include research stations, this include power projects, this include, I mean, like of course, like India is a country that also have like nuclear bomb in that sense, yeah. So, like this to get as a locational sense for you to have a look at. Now, these are nuclear power plants among them actually that are proposed, that are in expansion, that are like also being like both expansion as well as new reactors in that sense. So I'm like my PhD actually, like field work, both looked at these two actually, which is here in the extreme south and here in Maharashtra in the Jaitapura. So now getting into the book actually, what I tried in this book was to try and showcase these movements from all across the country, where I sought help from my friends and colleagues and like other academics who were also been working on similar movements. Now, what we do in the book is kind of try and like showcase most of these movements from all across the country. So, like I have like all these chapters in the book where where we like deal with most of these movements, looking at history of those movements and also how and why these particular opposition movements were like emerged in these particular like locations. Now, like some of them did their PhDs on them, and like some of them like were directly or indirectly were associated with them. So, like I'm going to get in detail into these chapters in a moment. Yeah. Now, I'm just quickly going to jump into the two locations which I have like studied in detail actually. Now, this is one of the projects that I was talking about in the southern India, in the state of Tamil Nadu, called Kudankulam project. This was actually one of the like earlier projects, which also comes along with the larger or the like longer history of nuclear like power in India. So we have had this like Gorbachev and Rajiv Gandhi like signing this in around 89 for 6 reactors in that sense, and then like immediately then we have like local oppositions beginning from there, though these oppositions were not as strong as how they later developed into or got organized into. What we have now from like, let's say, from like 89 to now is that we have 2 reactors running in this particular place, and like of course with frequent shutdowns in the reactor, which you would like probably see in the newspapers, and some of them don't make it to the newspaper as well. So you have series of like protests in different volumes, different like degrees, different organizations, and like activists in that sense, and yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit like more about the nature of opposition in that sense. So now people ask a lot of questions in that sense, you know, like why do people oppose these power project? Is it primarily because they would probably lose land in that sense, or are they impacted by the kind of campaigns which says that nuclear power or the nuclear radiation in that sense is like bad for health, for agriculture, for fishing in that sense, for the fish in that sense, yeah. So when I have been staying in Kudangulam and like conducting my field work, this was like quite surprising for me to learn even the so-called illiterate people that the Indian state would like otherwise call them, who are opposing these nuclear like power projects, would tell me much complex like technicalities of nuclear power and nuclear reactors in that sense, and how would probably be they would make you know, huge dangers to their lives, their livelihoods, and the way in which how this would be like much more dangerous in that sense for the future generations who are coming there. So you would say they like talking about also how various ways in which how the state itself has violated a number of regulations that the NPCL or the Department of Nuclear Energy in that sense, or even the IAEA, which kind of governs or regulate global nuclear matters in that sense. So you would see these very so-called allegedly like illiterate people talking about these complexities and kind of arguing that why this is a problem and why this is complicated to have a nuclear power in this particular region in that sense. Of course, this has also been impacted by history of the environmental movements in India, specifically to do with what happened after the Bhopal gas accident. Yes, thank you. And also, like in terms of what was going on elsewhere in the world, particularly about Fukushima incident was also kind of impacted in that sense. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to get into some of these in detail, but we can come back to that specifically to kind of talk about, you know, how do state itself violate its own rules and regulations when it comes to nuclear power, and how that is very peculiar to the India's nuclear establishment in that sense, to kind of establish nuclear power, maintain that, and also to kind of prevent any sort of criticism in that sense, which are raised by like by the media or local people or activists or academics in that sense, or even scientists. This is how the Kudangulam project actually from the outside looked like. Now this is actually very important picture in that sense for us to understand that. So this is what you could see the power station there, and these are like local fisher folks actually who are up and protesting this particular project in that sense, who were of course was really being like suppressed by the state, which I will be like talking about.
Ajmal,
Yes.
could we go back to this one? And maybe you can ask people how they read it, how they interpret it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if any of you have a sense about how do we think about, you know, like local oppositions like this. Like for example, I mean, this might not also be so different from maybe how do we think about how things are done even here in Canada.
We could have taken this photograph 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, just up what we call House Sound, which is just, I think it's over there, towards a town called Squamish, and near which there's a very large pulp mill. And so as you approach the pulp mill, it would look like this. And it has its own power supply from a hydro dam or hydro plant that's on the mountain above it. And the ships come in from Japan or from Korea to load with newsprint. It was a pulp and paper mill. And the pulp mill emitted sulfuric acid at the beginning in I think, larger quantities, but they were trying to diminish it, but still it was emitting pollutants into the sea. So the fishermen this was a very famous space for salmon runs, and fishing was very good in the Howe Sound, but gradually their catches declined. Not to zero, but to a level where commercial fishing was not viable. There are still boats with licenses in Squamish, but the number is very few. And so we have a kind of climate justice phenomenon quite like this close to us. It's not caused by the pollutants from a reactor, though I suppose those are captured for some hundreds of years. I mean, the water, the coolant is retained on site? No, it's released into the sea. Okay.
Really?
So just this. And these are fishermen and not protesters, or they've come.
So I mean,
they're fishing.
Yeah. So like there's no big difference between the fishermen and the protester here actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. So like these are local fishermen who have learned about nuclear in that sense, and who have been at the forefront of opposition. And most of these people now have massive number of cases charged on them actually. That includes anti-national, seditious, some of these charges. So now the local police station at Gudamkulam has the record of charging a highest number of cases actually on people in the history of the independent India actually. Now those cases were actually against these local fisher folks actually. So
right.
This is also about how do the Indian state engages with the local people who were opposing. For example, this is well documented in the sense that how like large dam projects in that sense, historically in India, was opposed by the Adivasis, and how state engaged with them was actually like well documented. So this also like more or less the like same story in that sense about how do state engage this opposition from the like local people.
Is there another way to read this image? For example, the daughters of these men are probably in school,
Absolutely, yeah.
and when it comes time for their exams, they want to study at night. And so the ancient, in the old days, they would have used kerosene lamps to study by. But now these people would prefer to have electricity and electric lights for their kids to study. So are they sensing the contradiction that the reactor may give them some electrical power or supply to the grid, which they are using, their kids are using to study math and history, etc., etc. Can we talk about that contradiction?
Yeah, like of course, but then the crisis there is this, that we do know that the nuclear is not producing a substantial amount of energy actually in that sense.
Right.
Like if we talk about that, one of the substantial progress that like India is like making now is from both solar, wind and all. So like in the past, like let's say like less than a decade, like India has like produced massive energy from like solar in that sense actually,
Yeah.
with the massive solar expansion actually. So like it's also important that like the fact that nuclear is not producing much energy.
No,
like, in that
as
sense is also-
Ramana said,
of course.
this was probably designed and conceived in the early 1980s.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's 30,
Yeah.
it's been 30 years.
Yeah.
But what I'm getting from what you're saying so far is that there is so much state propaganda which is in collusion with the uranium production that is doing this to the local livelihood.
Absolutely.
So there is no democracy.
That is what is the largest democracy in the world is doing, like in terms of like dealing with the nuclear power.
Mhm.
It's being squashed by the status quo.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Continue, please.
Yes.
It's
So-
scary.
It is. So this is actually the Indian Air Force actually that deals with these like so-called like unarmed small villages in that sense, So the Indian state has to bring even the Air Force actually to like deal with these small fishing and like farming communities in that sense who are kind of opposing these. Yeah. So which I can come back to when we talk about this later. And like I do have like testimonials or accounts of people who were part of these movements who could kind of say that like what was going on locally in their villages historically about when since the plan of like or the proposal of this project came to the commissioning of that, and how like a lot of them got involved in opposition to this particular project in that sense. These are so the Indian state would call these women as the most dangerous anti-national threats to the state or democracy. Some of them actually in their records of law, like in their records of first investigation reports that these officials make actually. These were like the number of cases actually like which were there actually. So So like you will have an idea about what I'm talking about.
So the state is actually turning justice on its head and blaming the citizens for protesting for legitimate reasons.
Yeah. Now I'm just going to quickly jump into the next location which I was doing my field work at. So this sport is not very far from the city of Mumbai actually, which is known as the financial capital of India. Now this is relatively a new project actually, which was agreed between when the Nicolas Sarkozy was the French counterpart, when Manmohan Singh was the India's prime minister. Yeah. So this was actually being done with the French nuclear corporation called Areva, which then went into huge crisis, and then this was later shifted into the Electricité de France, which is the nuclear or the electricity department of the French government. Now, this is one of the world's biggest nuclear power plants in the world, as proposed actually. Yeah. So you would see the Ministry of Environment and the forest giving an environmental clearance to this particular sport, and then much before that you would see massive land acquisition for this project was done actually. Now in the aftermath of declaration of this project, as well as the clearance from the Ministry of Environment, as well as these agreements between India and France, and the local land acquisition by the local government in that sense of of course where times when massive opposition started against this particular project. So the future of this project, or the present of this project, is this, that after the land acquisition of this project, there has not been much development from both India and France in that sense. This was partly also because of the way in which how Areva nuclear corporation got into crisis, and I just also want to highlight that how a lot of nuclear corporations also rely on some of these massive expanding countries in that sense, India, for example, and they look at countries like India as a huge market in the future, for them to export nuclear power. So it is important for those corporations that India also engaged in these kind of nuclear expansion, so that they can also survive in that sense. Yeah, this is how Jetapur project sport used to look like actually. So you can see the way in which how they guard it or protect it in that sense. Now in Jetapur as well, you would see a series of things that these again so-called uneducated or illiterate farmers and fisher folks would tell you that why are they opposing this particular project in that sense, apart from the fact that this would probably impact the volume of their catch, or the market of their catch in that sense, which would then be labeled that, see, look, this fish is coming from locations nearby nuclear power project, which might not be healthy or good for that reason. So, again, a number of reasons in that sense about, how now, I'm talking about one of the region of India, which is one of the most biodiverse in that sense, like not only like in terms of the biodiversity, but also in terms of like national parks, like sanctuaries, and also like a lot of fish in that sense, which get exported actually like directly from there to countries like to like Europe, to like UK in that sense, even to like countries like Japan in that sense. So like I'm talking about that kind of a region, and like some of you must have heard about this name called like Alfonso Manco, which you would get in the like international market as one of the exotic like import from India in that sense, and this is the exact region from where it comes from.
And this is the season for that mango.
Yeah.
May.
Yeah.
May month.
Yeah. So you have where you know like a range of things that they kind of like talk about, including the credibility of the European like reactors in that sense, that and how the like credibility of the plant reactor in that sense, about you know the like technological plausibility of that in that region. Like again, seismic zone of this location, the environmental clearance in that sense. So you would also see like a lot of fabricated environmental clearance reports like produced in India, like particularly as far as the nuclear power is concerned, which I can also like talk about. So now what I'm going to do, this is again you know the land acquired actually for the Jetapur project, where the Nuclear Power Corporation would say that we have not acquired any land that is being like cultivated in that sense, or the agricultural land in that sense, to kind of say and show that you know they are not using agricultural land, so that you know you need not to oppose by saying that you know you have acquired agricultural land for a nuclear power project. So like of course again range of ways in which how do people like talk about you know why are they opposing this particular project, yeah, and you know how like farmers in that sense, like what happens to a farmer once their land is like taken away, and you know you just would give some amount of money by which they would probably be like able to like survive, like let's say like a year or two, and then what are you going to do, is one of the primary question, even for those like farmers who have like fair amount of land in that sense. Okay, quickly also to give a context of the other locations, and as well as what like broadly the book is like trying to do, which also include other locations apart from the two which I was talking about. Yeah. So the movements in India are substantially different from the movements in Europe, North America, and elsewhere outside South Asia. They have a different history, the socio-political compositions within the movements and how they emerged, their ideological base, the issues that they have raised, their demands, and the way state engaged with them, and the impacts that they created on the state and the nuclear policy. Early studies on the nuclear expansion and discontent against the nuclear power projects in India have mainly argued that these are protests for an alternative imagination of development inspired by alternative notions of the post-colonial state development carried out without nuclear weapons and nuclear power in that sense. Like for example, in that, like how do people looked at the state development in that sense in the in India in the like post-independence. Now they showcase the nature of the state's interaction with the local people, where the projects are being established and their negotiations with the nuclear establishment and the nature of scientific knowledge of the Indian state in the nuclear matters. Now, studies have also looked at the nature of nuclear state in India and the radiant infrastructures that the state creates while engineering death conditions for the local people. So, what we kind of do in the book is that we try and take these discussions further while approaching them through the local protest mobilizations. Now, in Perinam, which is one of the movement, one of the first sort of opposition, which is emerged from the state of Kerala actually in the South India. The concerns were environmental, and the opposition to nuclear power in Kerala was raised by middle class intellectuals, writers and activists forming a movement unlike others. However, in Kudamkulam, where I was talking about, the protesters highlighted several questions such as the high density of population in the region, the tragic experience of tsunami which happened in the 2004. I don't know how many of you remember this, that we have had devastating experience of tsunami in the southern states, particularly in in Tamil Nadu. The environmental impact assessment procedures, coastal zone regulation, site evaluation study, safety analysis report that were not shared, substandard construction materials used, and the accidents within the project, long delays in construction, and frequent shutdown after commissioning. Furthermore, in Mitti, which is again here, the opposition groups raised concerns over flaws in the environmental impact assessment, land livelihood concern of the farmers, and the inherent vulnerability of nuclear energy and the future radiation from the project. Now, in Jaitapur, it was pointed out that the fragile environment of the region is threatened by the nuclear project, while other studies have highlighted that with the new European pressurized reactors that is proposed for the plant, the movement also raised questions about comparative higher cost of the power generated from the reactor in Jaitapur, land, and the livelihood crisis of the farmers and fishers. Now, in Gorakhpur and Haripur, the movements highlighted land, livelihood, environmental concerns of the farmers and fishers. In the state of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, the concerns of land and livelihood gained importance along with the survival of the indigenous people who resides in the locations where the projects are proposed and the uranium mining is going on. In the state of Jharkhand, which is one of the first uranium near mines of India, the life and survival of the Adivasi communities or the indigenous people in India, the harrowing experience of living in the surrounding of the uranium mining ponds, and the human health crisis it created became central to the opposition there. It is evident, therefore, that in each movement has its own identity rooted in the individual case of the project, its location, and the people who reside there, and the local history of development. How oppositions emerged locally and how nuclear establishment engaged with the opposition at this site. Now, the movements were of course inspired to begin with by the international anti-nuclear and the environmental movements, and both environmental justice movements as well as of course again climate justice movement as well. They gained momentum from multiple nuclear accidents and disasters around the world and the local histories of socio-political and the environmental movements and their respective states and regions. Now, the primary contention of these groups was the nature in which the nuclear power and the possible radiation and the concerns over the governance of nuclear energy and transparency and the history of accountability of the Indian nuclear establishment and the concerns of democracy in the process of planning, setting up, maintaining and decommissioning the projects. Though the concerns around nuclear power projects in India begin with life, land, livelihoods, in the process the indigenous people, fishers, farmers became aware of nuclear power, its inherent challenges of radiation and the way the Indian nuclear establishment operates, its governance, etc. In this way, they became organic, grassroots anti-nuclear activists. It can even be said that over the course of the movement, the so-called illiterate farmers and fishers, indigenous communities or the Adivasis, became equipped to challenge the powerful Indian nuclear establishment and its argument in favor of nuclear energy and nuclear expansion. Now, these movements have thus emerged as the safeguards of democracy and contribute towards democratizing the governance of nuclear energy in India in some way. It must not be forgotten, however, that the local people became permanent victims of radiation and allied risks once a project begins its working, like in Kudamkulam. Hence, the anti-nuclear struggle in India is also struggle for democracy through consistently pushing the nuclear energy establishment to be more accountable, transparent and democratic. Now, in the process of this, a more democratic energy future and the movements were brutally suppressed. Protesters were killed, like of course I was showing this. These are also the images of people who were actually killed, whose like pictures kept in the protest sites. Now, the ideological orientation of these movements are often the collective ideology of multiple groups that include several layers of the Indian environmentalism, which is again like a broad area to kind of engage with. I'm not getting into it. Gandhians, the umbrella of the left groups, ideologies of the national and the local political parties, and local alternative environmental groups and collectives and their own context. Now, they are also rooted in ideas like non-violence and with a clear understanding of the history of nuclear energy and deconstructing the dominant notions of the state-led development with nuclear power. Now, the formation of Green parties in the 1970s and the 80s in the Europe was one of the result of the anti-nuclear politics there actually. In India, much later in 2010, Mr. Uday Kumar, he was like one of the leading figures of the protests in Kudamkulam, joined hands with the Aam Aadmi Party, which was called AAP in Delhi, an alternative political front formed in Delhi. Now, 3 other leaders from Kudamkulam contested in the Lok Sabha election in 2014, and Uday Kumar later formed a Green party in Tamil Nadu. Now, apart from this, most of the movements experienced a pragmatic electoral politics at local levels, where sometimes local parties supported them, while most of the time they had to fight against them whenever these local parties or their coalitions were in power in the state or at the central government. Hence, it's also clear that the anti-nuclear movements in India are not unique to the history of nuclear power, nuclear expansion, but the issues at their core have as much as to do with the land and livelihood concerns. In many Asian countries, particularly in the dictatorships, the anti-nuclear movements emerged as part of democratization movements there, while in India, the movements grew to democratize the nuclear establishment and question the state mandates about them. Now, the social composition of each movement is different given the nature of the local socio-compositions. Most of them have people from like tribal communities or the Adivasis or the indigenous people, fishers, farmers and women from these communities as predominant mass base. And the others have urban civil society activists. The mass base of these movements have mostly been made up of fishers, farmers belonging to Dalit and the other lower caste groups from Christian, Muslim and the Adivasi communities who lived close to this project site.
Ajmal, it's almost 3 o'clock.
Yes, having
And I hope we can engage the audience
Yes.
in
So I'll just read a line and
discussion.
then I will finish that. Now, they were also informed by the urban or semi-urban based environmental and the anti-nuclear groups demonstrating the dynamics of the leadership. These activists, who are scientists, engineers, journalists, academics from major force in the movements, and act as an alternative expertise vis-a-vis the state expertise on nuclear energy in India. Thank you.